This'll sound insane to most of you, but like almost every other short guy, I used to want to be taller. Until one day I flipped and started wanting the opposite. Confused? Well, I'll show you why. And why envy doesn't die when you accept yourself. It just changes targets. But on that day the switch flipped, there was something I never saw coming. It was like I beat one boss, only for the next stage to spawn in with the exact same moveset and just a different skin. And that boss is envy. And my story will help reveal its hidden mechanics, not just the symptoms of its attacks. I get a lot of comments from people who think that because I talk about heightism all the time, that means I must hate tall people. As a short guy, I'm jealous of them. But it honestly couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it's closer to the opposite. Now, let me make this clear. I don't hate anyone for something about themselves that they can't change. But I do not envy tall guys for their height. And that's what I'm going to get into this story. It's actually the short guys who I envy for their height. Now, I'm already a short guy at 5'3.5", who stopped growing at the age of 12 due to chemical exposure that I'll get into later in the video. Now, you're probably thinking, why the hell would you envy guys that are shorter than you? That doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't, unless you understand the full spectrum of information. Basically, when I see a guy who's shorter than me, it chips away at the role that I've envisioned myself in, that I have come to identify with over the last decade. My personal sense of identity, it's heavily wrapped up in this view of myself as this cute, stunted little short guy who likes to be towered over and dominated by tall women. So obviously, when I see a guy who's going to make me feel average and no longer the smallest guy in the room, I'm going to feel like I'm having an existential crisis. Yes, I envy shorter guys, but I also would much rather be an extremely tall man than an extremely average man. And I'll probably get into the reasons for that more in a later video. But first, let me tell you a story that sort of demonstrates what I'm trying to explain in action. So it was the first semester during my second year at college, and I had just had that switch flipping experience where I suddenly went from wishing I could be taller and hating my body and being heavily insecure with an extreme inferiority complex wrapped around my height to suddenly actually becoming this masochistic person that liked the view of myself as being stunted and inferior. So when I went back to school and all those same tall women and superior jock athlete guys that walked by me and made me feel so small and insignificant during my Geomaxxing compensation phase of my life, now all of a sudden brought me intense excitement and joy and arousal. The feeling was intoxicating. But I do remember when I was at that community college, there were a few people around my age that I would cross paths with who I didn't know personally, who set off my insecurities once again in a way that I never would have expected before in a million years. So before that fateful day in November of 2015, which I go through the full story in my Why I Like Being Short video, which I'll link at the end, whenever I saw one of these guys who were shorter than me walking by me on campus, it made me feel a lot better. It actually gave me a dopamine rush and the feeling like, see, I'm not the shortest guy. And I can go along with my day with a little bit more confidence. But after that, those feelings all changed. And I really thought I'd be free from the envy once and for all. I really thought that now that I embraced myself and my height insecurities were gone, I would no longer know the feeling of envy. But boy, was I wrong. Because there were a few kids that went to that college who, those very same ones that made me feel better about myself, all of a sudden made me feel much worse. I remember this one in particular. He was this dark-skinned Asian kid with a short, buzzed haircut, and he liked to wear long, baggy shirts that accentuated his smallness. But every time I saw him, It shook the universe that I had built for myself in my head. It was like I was being robbed of my very identity and the role that I'd created for myself. Like, okay, I get to be this small, inferior manlet who gets to feel vulnerable and weak and submissive. But then I walk by someone who's even more vulnerable, weak, and inferior looking. And all I can think of is why? Why does he get to experience more of what I want to experience than me? It just felt like every time I saw him, that very same new identity that had saved me from raping was being crushed and erased bit by bit. And anytime I saw him in the distance, just like I used to do with the tall kids that I didn't want to walk past, all of a sudden it was the short guy who I didn't want to be anywhere near because I wanted to be the smallest. I wanted everyone to see me as the puny little manlet. And I'm ashamed to admit this, but after a certain amount of time, I begun to hate this guy, like legit. I couldn't stomach it. Like I couldn't hide my feelings in my face. I try not to make eye contact with him, but I couldn't help myself but try and compare heights anytime he walked past. And every once in a while I would glance up and he probably saw me looking at him like this and wondered what the fuck did he do wrong? Like he doesn't even know who I am. And it's crazy to think that it bothered me that much to have this guy walk by me who's only like 2 inches shorter than me. But it really did. But as much as it ate away at me to see this guy every once in a while, I eventually left that school and moved on to a 4-year school. And I thought, okay, hopefully here there won't be any more guys that are shorter than me. But of course, 5'3.5", 5'4", it's pretty short, but in reality, there are quite a few men who are shorter than me. And I just didn't want to accept that reality. I wanted to live in a world where I was the smallest in every room, where I got teased and picked on for my height and secretly enjoyed it. But it's one thing to have an Asian guy or a Mexican guy walk by me and make me feel tall or make me feel average by comparison. And it doesn't happen that often. But when it does, it is like 99% always somebody of either one of those two ethnicities. But if it just so happens that a white guy is shorter than me, it bothers me a lot more for some reason. And I think I understand and have my own theory as to why this is. And I believe that's because my way of coping with seeing guys shorter than me was to tell myself that, okay, they're shorter than me because they're of those other ethnicities. And I should just mainly compare myself to other people of European ancestry, even though I do have some Latino blood. So I just tried to tell myself, all right, you may not be the shortest man of all, but you are the shortest white man of all. And I was able to latch onto that and feel better about my new identity and more secure in it. But what happened was, of course, eventually over time, I would run into guys who were white, who were also shorter than me. And when I encountered that, my world just crumbled. Like I would go home, I would feel so upset. I would question my entire reality, my entire existence, tell myself like, am I really, really like that short? Like I wish that I could be them. But at the same time, I'd be able to cope with that a little bit as well by telling myself, okay, I may not be the smallest guy of European ancestry. I may not be completely height mogged by a tall woman to the absolute extreme degree that they do, but it's pretty damn close. And at the same time, I've got an attractive face, and that gives me actually a better chance of finding the height reversal relationship that I'm actually looking for. So I can tell myself, okay, that makes me in actually a better position than them in many ways. But if I just ever so happen to come across a guy who is multiple inches shorter than me, who's also of European ancestry, and who also is as attractive as me in the face or more, that's when my entire reality would crumble to the ground. And that's a problem because it really goes to show and demonstrate my original point that a lot of you might be able to relate to is that when you overcome one original source of envy or insecurity, if you aren't able to do it in a more stable and sustainable way, then you're very likely to end up in a situation like me where eventually those feelings of envy are going to transfer over into a new target because you didn't actually fix the original source of the problem. So maybe now it makes more sense to you after hearing that story why I actually fantasize not about being taller, but about being shorter. Because it would help me more effectively align with and represent that role for myself that I would like to inhabit of being this puny, frail, stunted manlet. And I know I've made a video about leg lengthening surgery before, but I had not yet known at that time when I made that video that leg shortening surgery actually exists. I would much, much rather get leg shortening surgery than leg lengthening surgery. Now you might think, oh my God, this guy is fucking crazy. And yeah, I am a little bit crazy. But alas, the leg shortening surgery thing is probably never going to happen because I can't afford it. I don't want to have to take a year off out of my life. And I don't know how it would impact my proportions. If I were to figure out that I had the proportions for it, then sure, I'd be down. But I really, really wish that it could also make my hands and feet smaller. Now, my upbringing wasn't the healthiest, and it was a major contributing factor leading to me halting growth at the age of 12 at 5'3.5". And I know this because my genetically predicted height was 5'9" or 5'10". But I have this fantasy that involves reliving my life from the ground up with all the knowledge and understanding of my future self that I have now. And a lot of you guys probably can relate to that. Let me know in the comments how many of you think about that a lot, because I think about it almost every day. And you might think of it in a way of you wish that you could go back and relive your childhood so that you could reach your maximum genetic potential and not make the same mistakes that maybe your ignorant parents allowed you to make. But for me, as you can imagine, my fantasy is the opposite. And I'll get deeper into what specifically I would have liked to change throughout my childhood. But first, I'll tell you the story of what it was that I consumed and was exposed to throughout my childhood that led to this situation of my growth being stunted and this severe insecurity and inferiority complex developing in my teen years that led to me snapping and becoming the freak I am now. Quick disclaimer, this is my story. This is not advice. Do not copy me. Okay, let's get into it. So between the ages of about 7 and 13, I had developed very unhealthy habits that my family enabled. I would eat a bag of flamin' hot Cheetos all to myself at the end of almost every school day. Cheez-Its, snacks, processed foods. We would eat microwave meals and TV dinners and frozen pizzas all the time. We ate fast food multiple days a week. I drank more soda than I did water, got very little exercise, and basically spent 6 hours a day gaming. I didn't play sports, I wasn't active, and what do you expect? I became overweight. I was sickly, pale. I felt ill and unhealthy. Every day at school, I remember, especially in the 3rd and 4th grade, I was constipated. Like, I would go 3 or 4 days between bowel movements. And I remember going to school the next day after an unhealthy evening and being unable to concentrate and focus on my work because I was feeling this nauseous feeling where I don't know if you guys have ever experienced it before. It's like you get a cold sweat, you can tell that the color is draining out of your skin, and you just feel like you have to go to the bathroom, but you can't. And it's a horrible feeling. You can't focus on anything else. And that's the way I felt at school almost every single day. And it made me very weak and sickly. Not only that, but I was playing around with a lot of sketchy chemicals from a very young age. Had all these toxic kids soaps. I'm sure a lot of you your parents got you those soaps. It's full of chemicals that should not be given to kids. I also played around with shaving cream. I messed around with marine paint because I would help my grandpa paint his boat, and that is not something a child should even be breathing in the fumes of. I remember playing around with this toxic toy goo that came from this weird toy in Kmart, and we would use the shit out of this toxic sunscreen and all of this stuff, the shaving cream, the goo, the soap. I would get it in my mouth. In fact, sometimes I would just eat it for fun, just to prove to other people that I was tough. I remember my grandma giving me this can of Lysol just to spray the crap out of all over my bed every night to kill germs. She was big on killing germs, when in reality, it's better to have those germs around than to be the childhood guinea pig of a chemical that has never been tested on developing children before. Then you've got chemical sensitivities that developed due to years of exposure to my mom's excessive use of cheap perfume that I'd get stuck in the car with her. And I'm sure a lot of you guys had similar experiences. And all of these chemicals, these preservatives, the lack of proper nutrition, it stressed my body and pushed it to a point where I started developing puberty at an unnaturally early age. And I'm talking body hair at like 5 years old. But as a result of this unnaturally early puberty, I started to have to use acne cream and adult deodorants at an unnaturally early age. I'm having to use products only meant for adults containing chemicals that are even more potent and powerful in their puberty accelerating effects. And this is only further accelerating the onset of this unnaturally early puberty. Mind you, I didn't realize any of this at the time. I thought everything happening to me was totally normal. And even though I compared myself to other guys my age and saw that I was a lot hairier and thought about girls a lot more, I just thought that's because I was cool. And I remember this influx of testosterone and just seeing my body develop when I was about 9 years old. I remember looking in the mirror, seeing my shoulders got a little bit wider, and I just had this feeling of confidence and power that I was going to be a big, strong man, and I'm going to be powerful, and I'm going to dominate everybody. And that's what was in my head, because testosterone was flowing through my veins at an age when it really shouldn't have been. But as I've said before in other videos, as I progressed through my teen years, I started noticing that I was no longer growing, and I was told that my growth plates refused. And that's when this extreme inferiority complex plagued my mind. And every year that went by, every week, every day, it would get worse and worse and worse. And I tried to cope for a while, and I tried to do Geomaxxing, and in the end, I could no longer deny the reality. I'm inferior. I'm unnatural. I'm an abomination of nature. And there's a good reason why girls don't like me. Because I am objectively less than. After discovering that I was inferior and realizing I could no longer deny it, I basically lost my mind. And it was at that time, when I was 19, in the midst of college, that I hit rock bottom. And on that day that switch flipped, I went from one extreme of hating my body and wishing I could be reborn as somebody else to completely the other extreme of absolutely loving the fact that I was inferior and stunted and exposed to all these chemicals. And for the first year or so, I didn't have any of these thoughts of wishing I could go back to my childhood and relive my life, because I was actually happy and I saw myself as I'm an inferior manlet and I'm the shortest guy in basically every room I'm in, and I've learned to love it. But once enough time passed and I started seeing other guys walk by me who made me look average by comparison, after a while, that's when this fantasy came through my head that I wish I was even more stunted. I wish I was even more inferior. I'm not inferior enough. I'm not unnatural enough. Like, yes, I had a very unhealthy upbringing, but it really could have been worse. If I would have gone straight from drinking that lead and arsenic and pesticide-laden Monsanto baby formula into eating nothing but processed foods and junk food for every meal for my entire childhood, and on top of that would have been exposed to these chemicals even younger, then I would have been able to achieve my dream height of 4'10". if I ever encounter a guy who says that he's 4'10", I feel jealous because that is the height that I fantasize myself being at. Whenever I envision these scenarios, I think of a woman between the height of 6'5" and 7'4", dominating a man of 4'10". And he's like this stunted peasant who grew up in a very low-income household who couldn't afford to be fed anything other than the worst of the worst, compared with this towering elite from a wealthy family who got fed nothing but farm-to-table food her whole life. The elites are marketing these toxic products to people of the lower income levels in order to give to their children. It's a really messed up thing. But when I picture myself as wanting to fully embody that inferior identity and position at the bottom of the hierarchy, I picture myself going back in time and doing everything I can to reach that desired height of 4'10". Now, I just want to make it clear, these are not instructions. These are not recommendations. This is something that's very bad for you and could potentially lead to cancer. But a childhood of nothing but processed food, yes, it might have stunted my growth a couple more inches, but if I could just go back in time and expose myself to these endocrine disruptors at a much younger age, I probably would have reached that dream height of 4'10" that every day I wish I could be. It's those heavy-duty commercial cosmetic preservatives that really stunt growth, that really accelerate puberty. And that's where the parabens come in. I have this fantasy envisioning myself being back at that time at the age of 3, 4, sneaking into the drawers, finding these products with these obscene ingredient lists and consuming little bits of it at a time until eventually my puberty has an onset of several years earlier than it did in my current timeline. And yes, my feelings of insecurity and my inferiority complex would have been so extreme, but maybe, just maybe, I would have been able to snap and have that switch flip in my brain at an earlier age. And then I would have been able to go through high school fully confident and possibly even finding a tall girlfriend because I would have still had the genetics to give me an attractive face. And instead of being traumatized through the course of high school, I would have enjoyed the bullying, being towered over and belittled and teased. Now, I went over in much greater detail the story of what led me to snapping the way I did and going from hating my body to loving my body. But for just a quick synopsis, I had gone into the deepest, darkest depression of my life after years of bullying and self-hatred and comparison and seeing other people grow much taller than me and hearing girls say stuff like, "Oh, he's so tall and strong," and seeing it in my video games, all the height worshiping going on in all of our media everywhere. It really, really beats a short guy down as he's growing up. So not only did I have years of internalized self-hatred, but I also had been reading a lot of stuff on the internet that was getting into my head. Reading this feminist forum where they were talking about how worthless and inferior short guys were. Reading all these studies and articles about these chemicals and products that I was exposed to that the more upper-class peers that I grew up with weren't exposed to. Things that are endocrine disruptors that accelerate the onset of puberty, shoulder width, hip width, arm length, hand size, foot size. All that stuff can be affected by the presence of these chemicals in the bloodstream of a developing human being. But guys, on that fateful day, when I went from wishing I could be taller to loving my height and actually wishing I was shorter, I would do something that I would absolutely not recommend anyone do. Something that could have possibly led to cancer or all kinds of unpredictable issues with my health. That very night when I snapped and my life went from a living hell to a euphoric dream, I ended up regretting the entirety of the last 4 years that I had spent gym-maxing, having the best diet I possibly could, and doing everything I could to try and grow 1 more inch, which I didn't. So I decided I want to make damn certain that I don't grow even 1 more centimeter. So I put all of my knowledge to use and I thought, I'm going to go out and find something that's going to make sure I don't grow. And I do not recommend anyone do this. This is just a story. It's not instructions, okay? I went out to the local drugstore. I found myself a bottle of itching cream that had methylparaben in it, which I had read was the strongest paraben. I brought that home and I took a little bit of it and I did that until I decided, okay, that's enough. I'm not going to risk it anymore. And I don't know if it worked or not, but I can tell you that I definitely did not grow even 1 more centimeter after that. Although I'm not sure it would have mattered because I hadn't grown since I was 12 years old by that point, but I just wanted to make 100% sure. And that's the kind of thing I picture myself doing. If I were to go back in time and relive my childhood, I would go about doing something like that so that I could reach my dream height of 4'10", and then I'd never have to be jealous of a guy who's shorter than me ever again. I could have the cute face that I'm genetically predisposed to. I could have the stunted, warped body that is corrupted by endocrine disruptors and unnatural chemicals. And I'd never, ever have to go and get leg shortening surgery. So how about now? Am I crazy enough for you yet? But like I said in the beginning, this all just goes to show that even if you overcome an insecurity and it feels like you've won a war, the battle is not over. If you go from hating your body for something you can't change to loving that same thing about your body that you can't change, when you see people who have more of that thing that you love about yourself that you can't change, you're going to feel inadequate. It's kind of like with a tall guy who wishes he was taller. Everyone looks at him and says, bro, you're 6'3". Why do you wish you were taller? You're so ungrateful. But the reality is that there are plenty of guys who are a lot taller than 6'3", who are just as good looking, if not more. And I totally understand the feeling of not being enough. And it's a very similar thing with me. I just would never want to be under 4'10", because at that point, you're basically a medically diagnosed dwarf. And I don't want to be that. I want to be just on the edge of it. So what's the bigger takeaway here? If there's one thing that you take away from this story, it should be this. Even when you make peace with a trait you don't like about yourself, that insecurity often relocates. Same feeling, new target. So where did your insecurity move after you fixed something? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one. If today's video was about envy shifting, this one is a deep dive into why I like being short and the full story of how I became this way in all its brutal detail. Watch Why I Like Being Short to get the full picture, and subscribe for more Heightpill rants.